everybody. This is Jess from 3D Learning Experts, and you're listening to the LD Experts Podcast, the show for busy parents who want to help their kids with learning disabilities, or as I like to say, learning differences, go from surviving to thriving.
Hello. Today, we are talking to Virginia Spencer, who has a wealth of knowledge about IEPs and ARDs, which is what Texas calls IEPs, and she has a background with Angelman syndrome, which is something that most people are not very familiar with, and she just is a wealth of information. So without further ado, let me introduce Virginia to everybody. Welcome, Virginia.
Hello. Thanks for having me on, Jess. Do you want me to give a bit of background on how I got started in special education advocacy?
That would be amazing. Yes, please share with us.
Okay. So I'm a parent of 3 adult children, and my middle son was speech delayed, and we were in Kansas, and he was in a private preschool. And in fact, the school district was called in under the child fine mandate to look at his speech and see if he was in need of special education services in the early childhood realm. And they bugged me on the phone and they said, we really want to help. We want to give him intensive speech services. So that was my first experience with special education. I said yes. And he was bused to the school as a 3-year-old. And so we moved from Kansas to Illinois, and that progressed in Illinois, and he was eventually diagnosed as having autism. So I was that mom. I was the mom that was trusting the school districts. At that point, they were very willing to provide whatever he needed. And then we decided to move from Illinois. We got tired of the blizzards and the weather in general, and we came down to Texas. And that's where things got a bit more difficult. Texas is not as willing to provide services in general, in my experience. And so I was a mom. I also had an older son with a 504 plan. And pretty much they took most of his accommodations away as soon as we moved here.
Wow.
So we struggled with the school district here in Texas. And eventually I did use a dispute options under the Individuals with Disabilities Act. And I went to mediation. I filed Office for Civil Rights complaints on access for my kids. And I also went to an Office for Civil Rights facilitated mediation. And I also filed for a due process. So I did, in that time, while they were in high school or middle school, I did file all of these complaints. And basically, what happened was I called up the Parent Training Information Center, which each state has. And I said, do you have any jobs where I could help parents? And they said, yes, we have a regional coordinator opening in the Austin area, which is where I live. And I started this job, and it was like drinking from a fire hose. So I had so many professionals and parents call. And one parent called me, and she said, I want to go to one of your workshops at the weekend. So she showed up, and her son had been diagnosed as having a learning disability. And the school had written a pretty terrible IEP. It wasn't sufficiently comprehensive. It didn't address all of his deficits. And so I said, you should really go in and advocate for a better IEP. Maybe you should get an advocate. So she got an advocate. We all went to the admission review and dismissal meeting, which is the odd meeting, is called an IEP meeting in Texas. And the school reversed eligibility. And
Wow.
that, yes, that was the beginning of a journey, because I actually became a witness to a due process hearing, and the due process hearing, the hearing officer found for the parent, and he said the child should be admitted into special education. And that went to the Fifth Circuit because the school kept appealing the decisions which were in favor of the parent. And that is when I decided that I should become an advocate, because the materials that we were giving out as part of the PTI, which is a great service, and they do wonderful work, stopped at the information and referral level. So you couldn't actually go in and gauge how the parents are using this information. So I wanted to be able to see parents actually advocate in their meetings. So I set up as an advocate, and over the years that has developed into non-attorney representation. So I actually I file for due process, and I can represent parents at due process in Texas. Texas is one of those states. They do ask you to submit training and a resume, but if you're a member of the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, they're pretty much going to let you represent a parent. So in a nutshell, that is my journey from being a parent of a child with a disability to becoming an advocate in Texas. And there's been a lot of learning along the way.
Well, and like so many of us, your professional journey started because of your personal trials and tribulations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do all three of your kids have LDs or just the two?
I have my son with autism has dysgraphia, which of course is a written expression disability, and my daughter actually does have dyslexia, and she was a compensating dyslexic, which means she found ways to work around it until it became much too hard for her to keep up with the rigor of high school work. And it was a pretty interesting discovery because her English language arts teacher couldn't understand why she kept failing all these vocabulary tests. And the reason she was failing them was because the test took words out of context. So she couldn't read around the word, right? So she just completely flunked every time. And he said, I sat down with her and we did flashcards, and she looked pretty good, and I don't understand what happened. Well, what was happening was she couldn't retrieve the word from her
memory bank.
Orthographic, from that visual bank of words that are developed after you've learned the sounds and symbol connection, the phonological processing. So her phonological processing was at the 10th percentile. So that is why she was having trouble with that particular task, and it was a major grade. So she started failing English language arts.
And so she didn't have a 504 in place at that time?
Well, she had a 504 in place for ADHD, but what was happening was she was developing anxiety, which is pretty common for kids with dyslexia when, that is not being remediated. And she, of course, wasn't handing in work, which is another typical thing that kids who don't like to read or write do. They try and avoid the task, right? So it was a puzzle for the school. I knew as a parent that it probably wasn't ADHD related. And I couldn't find any research at the time as a parent on why she was struggling with not spelling, but it was his vocabulary at school, when technically she didn't have any other issues going on, right? So the school did a couple of tests, but unfortunately they're not timed tests. So it wasn't looking at, was she automatic in her basic reading skills? It wasn't looking at that. And I did find out from a certified academic language therapist that her reading fluency was very low, which would account for why she didn't like to read. So we've probably heard all these stories a million times, but for some reason they are a surprise to Texas educators or principals. And one of the things that Texas did recently, partly with the efforts of decoding dyslexia, was they updated the dyslexia handbook. And it does talk very vividly about these other mental health issues that might be going on while a child has dyslexia, especially at the high school, middle school, and high school level. And she was textbook for some of these. She basically wasn't available for instruction because of these developing anxiety disorders. And so as an advocate, I would say a big portion of my clients are, students who are in this position. And unfortunately, some of them have somehow been passed through, and they're in high school. So they have a very limited amount of time to catch up and remediate these skill deficits. And so what I do a lot of as an advocate is I will make a case for either school-provided compensatory services or privately provided compensatory services. And sometimes the schools will offer it, and sometimes you have to file for a due process to negotiate that. So it can be tough. It can be a tough realization for a parent that they're going to have to do something which isn't as friendly as they've been. They go through these stages of development. Oh, I trust the school. Now I don't trust the school. Now my child's suffering. Now what do I do? And can I do it without alienating everybody in the IEP meeting, right? So as advocates, we're always trying to respect the interests of everybody so that we can preserve those relationships. And I think that's a big part of it in being successful.
So was your daughter able to get over her anxiety and successfully catch up in school?
She did. I mean, eventually the school agreed to provide services, and they provided some pretty good ones. I'm lucky because this was many years ago now, and currently there's a real shortage of mental health professionals. So those school psychologists that are on campus are often floating. They're floating from one campus to another, or maybe the schools are contracting with a private person, but it's become much more difficult to get those minutes that the kids need to work on their coping skills in a clinical setting. And that's become very, very tough. And in Texas, we've seen a significant rise since the beginning of COVID in kids with mental health disorders and issues. So the schools are struggling. But in her case, she had someone who was able to collaborate with the outside people. And so there was that continuity of strategy. And we were able to incorporate it into the IEP. So
she had an IEP by then.
She did. She got an IEP, and it focused on her executive functioning issues because of the ADHD, but also the mental health issues as well.
Well, and the executive functioning issues can be across the board, right? I mean, that could have also been related to her dyslexia, just as much as her ADHD.
Well, she's in college. Well, I was going to say that all of those things can come together and create a perfect storm. It's almost like having a rash where the dots have joined, because you don't know schools start to struggle with what's the origin. Is it the anxiety first? Is it the ADHD? What is the origin, and how do we address it? And so, they all come together and they sort of provide this self-esteem crushing scenario, right? You've got the mental health, you've got the ADHD, you've got the difficulty with the academics, and then the child's just not going to show up mentally for anything.
Right.
And I have a lot of clients like that. They're not even willing to go on campus, or if they are on campus, they're in the bathrooms because they don't want to go to class. So they're not really available for instruction. So that it becomes like a perfect storm of problematic issues for the school district. So it's always good I think it's always good to get a private second opinion, even where the school's got some of it right, perhaps. If you get a private second opinion, you might have someone that has expertise in a certain area and they bring a different perspective. And oftentimes private psychologists do bring different perspectives to the table. And the schools have to consider it as part of delivering that free, appropriate public education. So, I've referred clients out to people that have expertise in trauma or severe psychiatric disorders, that are able to tease apart the ADHD from the dyslexia. Because sometimes when schools get to the fluency part of a learning disability in fluency, reading fluency, they often trip up and they'll say, well, it's probably because they're not self-monitoring because of the ADHD. So that in particular can be a really difficult area to examine. So I nearly always tell parents, look, go get your second opinion, get a licensed psychologist to tease this apart. It might be both, it might be either, but we need to know how to address it properly. And one of the things that I've told school personnel is it does matter, because if it's an ADHD issue, it's self-monitoring and you need to put a goal in place for that. But if it's dyslexia, then you need to look at the instructional methodology and is it appropriate for increasing that fluency for someone with dyslexia. So looking at repeated reading, applying strategies to text is going to be a different approach. So it does matter.
Mm-hmm. So in Texas, I don't know if psychologists are more reasonably priced or easier to find to get insurance coverage. In California, private psychologists can cost anywhere from $2,500 and up to $5,000. Is that still something that you see of value to invest that money in? Because for me, I always tell potential clients, I'd rather see you spend the money on tutoring and remediate the problem rather than just getting a certificate that the school may not even do anything with. Do you have different experience with that?
Well, if it's a school evaluation, every time a school does an evaluation, the parents have the right to get a second opinion at public expense, which means that the school district has to pay for it.
And is that federal?
Yes.
Oh.
It is. But what you're saying is true, because now the schools are bulking at the price of these independent evaluations, right? So they set criteria that they set their own criteria for getting an independent educational evaluation that can make it still cost prohibitive to parents. So they might try and manage that by designating certain people in the community that they want to do, that they want, parents to use. They don't have to. There are a couple of ways of approaching this, which is, I personally haven't had a problem connecting most parents with a particular group of evaluators that I like, that are qualified. What Texas has done in the last couple of years was they changed the practice of psychology rules to include people who were school psychologists that went out on their own and became independent school psychologists. So those people don't usually have a doctorate or a PhD or a license in psychology, but they're out there and they can do these independent evaluations. They're qualified.
Okay.
I haven't used any. Most of the people I recommend are licensed psychologists, and they're also LSSPs, which is a school psychologist designation. So you can get the school to pay for it. And if you want someone that is really expensive and you don't want to fight with the school over it, and I have personally filed on districts that have delayed, because they're not allowed to delay giving that IEE to the parent, and I filed to make them process the contracts faster because they've taken like months. So that's something that I've done. But those evaluations, if they're super, super expensive, then the parent could opt to shoulder some of the cost. But I've never had to tell a parent to do that, not so far. So that's something that's available to them.
That's great. So can you help people all over the country fight for these type of services?
I can. There are some different state regulations, but that one is one they can't change. It's so the school has an option. If you say, "Oh, I don't like this evaluation that you did on my child, and I want a second opinion," their options are to provide it without unnecessary delay, or to file a due process against you to defend it. And of course, anytime a school files, they have to get attorneys involved. It's expensive. Going to hearing is expensive. So usually schools don't counter file. They do provide the IEs. Now that could vary by school district. You'd have to be careful about that. You'd have to look up, what are the chances of them filing on me? Should I just get a private evaluation and pay for it?
So I have a student right now, and the mom told me that the school filed a due process against her. And I had never heard of that before. And I still don't completely understand what exactly that means. But can I give her your number and you could potentially help her with her fight against their due process against her? I don't even know if I said that right.
Well, it depends. If she has an attorney, obviously, that would be the go-to person, and they're able to provide legal advice. Some states do not allow advocates to represent parents.
Really? In court
Yeah.
or at all?
Well, at the administrative hearing, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you have to find an attorney that will represent, but I can certainly tell her, look, you should go get an attorney if that's what's happening. That there are parents that do this all by themselves, which is amazing. But usually the school law firms are not the lawyers aren't single actors, so they have a lot of resources. They can drown you in motions. They can do requests for productions, issue subpoenas. So you could get hit with a lot of things that you should be responsive to, and you're probably going to need legal advice on that.
And they have so much more experience than a parent who maybe this is their first rodeo.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm lucky I can do it here, because it's usually the reason that we file, and there are other advocates in Austin that file, it's not uncommon. And usually the idea is that it's a sort of a pressure tactic to ask the school districts, hey, look, we're serious about this negotiation and the services this child needs. Can we schedule a mediation? And so typically that is the idea, is that you are putting some time limits around that ask for a mediation, because due process timelines are set in stone unless both sides agree to extend them or change them. So that's what we do, a lot of us do here. And I especially like that, but it seems very aggressive, right? So the other thing I wanted to mention was there are some companies now that have been founded by adults with dyslexia, and they're trying to fund or get funding so that parents can get evaluation done very cheaply, for under $1,000 or around $1,000, which is relatively cheap.
Right, absolutely.
And there's
I have never seen it that low in California.
Yeah. I don't know the quality, but it's certainly something that could be investigated. But there's several nationwide companies now that are offering educational, neuropsychological, and educational evaluations to parents at this sort of lower cost. I'm not promoting them in any way. I'm just saying that they're out there, but those are options now, because I think people realize that there's a lot of value to getting these outside evaluations, but they're outside of the reach of most people. Mm-hmm. And especially parents that maybe are buying dyslexia, they're involved in buying outside therapies like dyslexia therapy, and other therapies. So I'm glad to see that is something that is being floated, and is something that's out there now by some of these entrepreneurs that want to help people with disabilities. So yeah, that is wonderful that is an available option now.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about you were talking when we met before, you were sharing about how Texas is using the components of reading by design, and could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so traditionally a lot of school districts in Texas use Orton Gillingham based and pretty solidly evidence-based programs like Take Flight, basic language skills. And House is in Houston, which is just down the road. And of course, Scottish Rite is in Dallas. So we have all these great programs that are not just research-based, but evidence-based for dyslexia. And the schools traditionally would start these programs and offer them. And most school districts do. However, what happened was the state decided that they would encourage alternative research-based programs. And the Educational Service Center for Region 4, which is the Houston area, they actually developed this program called Reading by Design, and it's not evidence-based. And so one of the things that parents worry about is they've got this program. The impetus for implementing this Reading by Design program is the cost of the implementer. So with Take Flight, you have to have someone who has a lot of experience, right? A certified academic language therapist, yeah.
Yeah, I was supposed to be trained in the Take Flight program when I was leaving Texas. And it was extensive training, and I couldn't, we had just moved and I couldn't leave my children for that extended period of time. So it is definitely extensive training.
Well, and hiring individuals that have this level of training is expensive. It's more expensive than hiring a new teacher, for example. And so the thing about Reading by Design is it only requires 5 hours of training. And so in theory, you could take any teacher, give them the training, and then they'd be able to implement this program. One of the things about Texas is we do have a dyslexia handbook. And in it, it lays out the components of what should be in a program. And one of the things that they talk about in the handbook is prescriptive teaching. So if a child is in a group, hopefully of kids of the same level of learning ability, they're in a cohesive group, and they're not responding to the instruction, then what do you do as an instructor in this program? And what I found is that the individuals training it are training to the book. They're not able to prescriptively say, this child needs more time in this skill or that skill, or this program isn't working for this child. We need to look at a different type of program, because they can't answer those questions. And the other thing that we see with this program is a complete lack of fidelity. You're supposed to get through a lesson a day. So that's 5 lessons a week in a school week. And I have clients who are getting through 2 lessons a week, or even 1. And what this means is that repetition isn't there, or maybe there is something else going on. We don't really know what they're doing. They're not getting exposure to the material. The fidelity has gone by the wayside. And it also means that if you're only getting through 1 lesson a week and not 5, it's going to take you 5 times as long to get through the program, right?
Right.
So you're going to get further and further behind. So we definitely have concerns about this program. And I have not seen any research that shows that in practice it's really effective. In theory, it should be, but in practice, we haven't seen anything come out yet.
And was that program supposed to replace Take Flight?
It is replacing Take Flight.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and it's replacing other programs.
And even like my kids, when we were in Texas, both of them had Take Flight in school, and it still wasn't as comprehensive as the one-on-one tutoring when I started working individually with my kids. So, I mean, even that wasn't as suitable. And now you're talking about something that's even more watered down.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what can parents do other than fight the schools or hire my company for private tutoring? But what solutions do you have? Any recommendations for parents?
Well, I do, and usually they involve a third-party expert, because what you need to do is to create an alternative narrative, right? So sometimes schools will say, your child's not progressing in this dyslexia program because just in general, their rate of learning is really low. And I've had clients they've got scholarships to summer programs at dyslexia schools, for example, and they made tremendous progress in a short amount of time. So what we do is we take that data, we go back to the school and we say, what were you saying about that slow rate of progress? Because I've got this data here and it says that my child can actually learn much faster. And so what we'd like to talk about is the appropriateness of the instruction. And if my child needs to be in a smaller group or one-to-one. And so you can go get that alternate narrative. The other thing that I do is I consult with dyslexia therapists, and I can get a piece of writing and other types of, pieces of work that show the impact of dyslexia and dysgraphia, and consult with my expert, and they can come back and say, well, this child's making phonological errors, they're making orthographic errors. And the other thing that you can do is you can do free testing. You could have someone do the Kilpatrick test, the PASS test, which is the phonological, I can never remember what these acronyms stand for, but it's called the Phonological Assessment Screener Tool, and Dr. Kilpatrick developed it. And that is a very powerful tool because it tells you really where is your child on their skill, on all of their skill components, and what do they look like in terms of grade level. And so I've had clients do this test, and and I had a high schooler, and when she did this particular test, the colt was able to tell me this child is not secure at any level on second grade skills. So it was pretty devastating, right? This child was 8 years below grade level on some of their basic reading skills. And when you start building that alternate narrative, it can become evidence for hearing. And I've done that. I've taken alternate narrative developed by private educational diagnosticians, CALTs, a CALT QI, and I went to a hearing and won because the hearing officer said there was such a weight of credible evidence that a child had dyslexia that the school needed to make up for their oversight and provide this child with 2 years of dyslexia instruction. So it was pretty powerful, but I actually didn't even have a licensed psychologist as an expert witness. It was all these very trained, very persuasive and credible experts in reading and reading programs. And so that's what I would advise parents to do. Now, schools can ignore outside information, right? But you can take it to your dispute options. It's always admissible in a dispute. So that's what I would encourage them to do. It's not the cheap way, obviously, but you could always go to someone who is in training and under supervision you could, because they'd have a reduced hourly rate, you should probably be able to get an assessment done that isn't as costly as going to a licensed psychologist, but still is helpful in terms of improving an IEP or getting eligibility.
That's great information. Thank you. So, Virginia, you said you can help people anywhere in the U.S. since we provide virtual tutoring. Our clientele are anywhere. So, what services can you provide people all over the country?
So, I can provide, I like to do a records review and write a report based on where I see the issues. And oftentimes we discover things because I look at things chronologically. There might be regression that no one has picked up on because they're not connecting an evaluation from 3 years ago to present day. I can look for things that could be improved in the IEP process, and I can help write goals that are much more measurable. And so usually I make those recommendations in a report review. I can do that for anyone, anywhere in the US, and just give them a roadmap of what's wrong, right? So they know where to go next. And if anything, it gives them an objective opinion on what's happening. And they may have been, I don't want to say misled, but oftentimes IEP teams paint a very rosy picture of how a child is doing.
And what is the best way to get a hold of you?
The best way is my email, which is info@lumenadvocacy.com, and that comes right to me. It's not a general mailbox. So, and the other thing that they can do is when I send a return email, I have a link for a Calendly initial consultation. So you don't even have to talk to me. You can shoot me an email, and if I respond, we can choose a mutually convenient time just by clicking on the end of my email signature. So
okay, well, great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your insight and wisdom and all the information that you shared with us today. I know my audience will definitely find it to be helpful.
I hope so. And thanks for letting me come on and just share, what we do here in Texas and what I do in specific. We're all out here and we all get wrapped up in our little practice in some cases, and it's great to come out and just share with you, and I'm glad that you're out here.
Well, I've learned so much doing my podcast, and so I hope my listeners also learn as much as I have from it.
Yeah, that's great.